I was going to call this a reflection on my guilty pleasure. But I don't think it is a guilty pleasure. It's a reflection on reading poetry, which in the last 7 or 8 years has become a source of huge delight to me. So, why did I even think about calling it a guilty pleasure? Well, I know nothing about poetry. I'm not just saying that, I really don't. So I'm at risk of being a serious candidate for Sude's Corner, a wannabe tortured soul who has a battered volume of sonnets sticking out of the pocket of his tweed jacket. It's true that one of the reasons that I'm not afraid to pick up a book of poems is my late schoolmaster, Mr. Newman, who taught me English at O level and A level. He was one of those teachers who some of us are lucky enough to have had, one of those teachers whose pupils never forget them. He radiated a love for Salisbury's own George Herbert and for Tennyson's Poems of 1842, which was quite infectious, to me at any rate. But that's nearly 40 years ago. I've not studied poetry in any formal sense since. I have a purely amateur interest. I pick something up and I read it. I like it or I don't. Let's keep this in proportion. I don't read anything as much as I'd like to. And when I do, I love reading novels. I enjoy reading history and even theology. And most years I tackle a biography or two. But alongside whatever else I'm reading, there's always likely to be a poet too, to be dipped into and quietly, profoundly relished. I don't follow particular periods or particular styles and can move with ease from Homer in translation to the present day. I'm shamelessly susceptible to influence in my readings. When I was in Canterbury, our Dean, Robert Willis, preached brilliantly on T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, and I've come to love those. As the pandemic struck this year, Mark Oakley, the Dean of St John's College, Cambridge, in an interview recommended W.H. Auden as the poet he would be spending lockdown with. So I've done that, or tried to. Actually, one of the few books about poetry that I've read is Mark's A Splash of Words. Here it is. I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't. So, assuming that this enthusiasm of mine is not simply a mostly harmless manifestation of my midlife crisis, what is the appeal of poetry? As some of you know, I trained as a lawyer, and lawyers deal in rigorous argument, admissible evidence, and defensible conclusions. These are all admirable and effective tools of the trade, and I give thanks daily for that part of my formation, which grew them in me and taught me how to use them. But on the journey into God, other tools are needed as well. In the courtroom, the submission is king. I once made the mistake of saying to a very crotchety judge, "Your Honour, I think." "Don't think," she snapped. make a submission. If the submission is upheld, that there is no evidence of dishonesty, for example, then the case fails. On the journey into God, we make submissions too. God is love, for example. And it's true, of course, that God is love. But it's also not true. The God of earth and heaven can't be contained by the word love or by what we understand by it. Love is just the closest we can get to saying something true about God. So our submissions on this journey are nearly always feeble attempts to articulate. They're rarely definitive and exhaustive truth claims, and that crotchety judge wouldn't care for them. Which is, I think, where poetry comes in. Poetry won't tell you how to bake bread or mend a puncture. It won't set out the theory of relativity or give an account of the defenestration of Prague. And this makes poetry, for me, a sort of training camp for the journey into God, or a roadmap for that journey. Poets, like pilgrims, are in the business of attempting to articulate. They deploy words to describe the indescribable. They turn phrases to give voice to the truth that they sense. They spin stanzas to articulate the music of the soul. Poets are our companions and our pioneers and our encouragers on the journey. I suspect that we're engaged in a very similar task. Ultimately, that task is less about understanding than it is about beholding. It's less about grasping hold than it is about gazing. It's less about defining than it's about adoring. I'll close, but I'll close with some words of George Herbert, his poem, Prayer, about as close to perfection as any human being has ever got. Prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reversed thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear. The 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed. The Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. Thank you.